Professor Wilcox is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia, where he is also the director of the National Marriage Project. Brad's research focuses on marriage, parenthood, and cohabitation, and especially the interactions between religious and cultural influences and the quality and stability of family life. He has published widely in distinguished sociological journals, the American Sociological Review, Social Forces, the Journal of Marriage and Family, and the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion. His books include Soft Patriarchs, New Men, How Christianity Shapes Fathers and Husbands, and with Kathleen Kovner-Klein, Gender and Parenthood, Biological and Social Scientific Perspectives. He also has a forthcoming book on religion, sex, love, and marriage among African Americans and Latinos. He is a devoted researcher. Brad earned his doctorate in sociology at Princeton in 2001 and has had a tremendous influence in my own scholarly life and that of many others. So please join me in welcoming Brad.
So I'm speaking today about this question of social justice and the family. And I want to make, of course, the point this morning that marriage is a matter of social justice. But in recent years, we've witnessed a renaissance in public interest in social justice. Here in the United States, for instance, public intellectuals and politicians, from Paul Krugman to Elizabeth Warren, have cast a spotlight on issues like inequality, poverty, and immobility. But globally, I think it's fair to say that today, there has been no more eloquent voice for social justice than Pope Francis. He has spoken out on inequality, decrying the ways in which, quote, the invisible hand of the market today seems so indifferent to the just distribution of income. The Pope has also called upon Christians and all people of goodwill to be, quote, attentive to the cry of the poor and to come to their aid, unquote, with a view of making the poor full participants in the economic and social life of nations around the globe. And the Holy Father has been a voice for the most vulnerable among us, including the children in our midst. In all these ways, then, Pope Francis has been an important voice in a growing global conversation regarding social justice. But I think that this conversation and the new attention it's devoted to questions like inequality, poverty, and children has generally not factored in the ways that a retreat from marriage in the West is both consequence and cause of the growing economic and social divides found throughout much of Europe and America, and the Americas. So I'm just going to briefly kind of give you a sense of what this divide looks like in some countries in the Americas and Europe, and then talk about its impact upon kids and societies before concluding this morning. So what we're seeing is that the West is increasingly separate and equal when it comes to marriage. There's a growing class divide where better educated Westerners are more likely to get and stay married, where their less educated peers are less likely to get and stay married and less likely also to enjoy high quality relationships or marriages. What of course this means is that kids, children in working class and poor communities are much more likely to not experience the benefits of growing up an intact married family over the course of their lives. So in the US, for instance, we see that there's been a dramatic increase in non-marital childbearing since the 1970s. But this increase, as this slide here suggests, has really been concentrated among those Americans who don't have a college degree. So the highly educated group here are college-educated moms, and everyone else to their left are less educated moms. So clearly there's a growing class divide when it comes to having kids outside of wedlock. And then this matters for, among other reasons, because it's connected then to sort of divergences in single parenthood. This slide comes from Robert Putnam's new book, Our Kids, and what you can see basically is that less educated moms are much more likely to be having their kids in single parent homes. whereas better educated moms are much more likely to be having their kids in two-parent homes. And one of the, I think, most striking things about the sort of growing class divide in kids' circumstances is that really since about the late 1990s, we're actually seeing, in a sense, more stability and less single parenthood among better educated Americans. So not only is there this growing divide, but those Americans who are college educated are in some ways sort of navigating contemporary family life better than even their peers, so to speak, 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And if you think this might be a phenomenon that's just limited to the United States, you'd be incorrect, because we see a kind of similar class divergence in our neighbor to the north in Canada here. We have obviously more two-parent families among the highest educated Canadians and less among the moderately and least educated Canadians. And the decline in two-parent families, much as in the United States, has been really concentrated among the sort of this lower middle class, this working class segment in Canada. I could show you similar slides in Chile, but I won't. I'm going to just switch and go across the ocean to Sweden, because when we're talking about these kinds of questions and issues, I think Sweden is often kind of put forward as an alternative to the American model. And we're seeing also in Europe that there's a growing class divide, both in marriage and in family structure more generally. But we can see this also here in Sweden, where again, non-marital childbearing is more common among less educated Swedes, and the pace, if you will, has accelerated more among less educated Swedes than it has among highly educated Swedes. And of course, again, as in the United States, in Sweden, this matters in part because it means that kids who are being raised in less educated homes in Sweden are much more likely to see their parents part ways by the time they turn 15 compared to their fellow peers in better educated homes in Sweden. So what I would say the bottom line here is the West is in danger of, quote, devolving into a separate and unequal family regime, where the highly educated and the affluent enjoy strong and stable households, and everyone else is consigned to increasingly unstable, unhappy, and unworkable ones. Now, why is this important? Certainly, in the academy and the media, sometimes you get this idea that we're kind of experiencing family diversity, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there are reasons, I think, to be concerned. And I say this as someone who was raised by a single mother. I think my mom did a pretty good job with me and with my sister. But I'm also a sociologist, and we know that kids who are raised in single-parent homes have more difficulties on average in terms of steering clear of events, things like prison or a teen pregnancy that might limit their future, among other things, economic opportunities. And they also have more difficulty in acquiring the human capital that's needed to thrive in today's labor market, compared, of course, to kids in intact married homes. So just take, for instance, this question of incarceration, of course, a very central issue today in many ways. What we can see basically is that even controlling for things like family income, family education, race and ethnicity, that boys who are raised in a single mother household are more than twice as likely to end up incarcerated, end up in jail or in prison by the time they turn 30, compared to boys raised in an intact home with their own married mother and father in the picture. And dads also matter for daughters as well. We see in work done on teen pregnancy that fathers who are there for the duration of their daughters' lives, from 0 to 18, are much less likely, that's the left bar, to have their daughters end up pregnant as a teenager. Whereas when they leave the home, obviously in these different periods, they're more likely to see their daughter end up pregnant as a teenager, not having his attention, his affection, his modeling love and respect between him and the girl's mother. These are all things that probably are implicated in these kinds of trends in the data. And again, the point I want to make too is that these kinds of patterns, the kinds of associations we see between family structure and kids' outcomes are not found just in the United States. They're found in many countries throughout the West, including a place like Sweden, where, again, both boys and girls who are raised in single-parent households are more likely to have emotional difficulties of the kinds that are noted here, things like suicide and substance problems. But then kind of putting this in a more positive light, or sort of focusing on the positive, what we can see, of course, also is that kids who are raised by their own two parents are more likely to acquire the human capital that they need to thrive in today's marketplace. So we see that for both kids being raised in less educated homes on the left of this slide, and kids being raised in better educated homes on the right of the slide, that kids who are being raised in an intact family, that's in blue, are more likely to graduate from college compared to their peers who are being raised in a non-intact family. And then if we look beyond, again, the United States to countries around the globe, what we see basically is in countries ranging from Chile to Colombia to Canada to Mexico to Germany to Sweden, that kids who are in single-parent homes are more likely to be held back in school. That is, they're less likely to get the human capital that they need on a timely way to thrive in today's marketplace if they're raised in a single-parent home compared to a two-parent family. So the bottom line here is that kids who are raised in that intact married family are more likely to avoid the detours and acquire the human capital they need to realize economic success later in life. So I've been speaking quickly about kind of the micro story, to use a more kind of economic language, and I want to turn now kind of more towards the macro story. Think about sort of the ecological story here as we think about the impact of the family on the society at large, or the economy at large. And when it comes, for instance, to questions about poverty, we see from the work of people like Bell Sawhill at the Brookings Institution that much of the increase in child poverty since the early 70s in the US can be linked to the growing share of parents, or say of families that are headed by single parents rather than by two parents. We also have been talking a lot these days about income inequality. And Molly Martin's work at Penn State suggests about 41% increase in family income inequality between 1976 and 2000 can be linked to shifts in family structure. My work with Robert Lerman at the Urban Institute suggests that about a third of the increase between 1979 and 2012 can be linked to a growing share of single-parent families in our country. So this is certainly one other way in which what's happening in the family is connected to what's happening in the larger society, the larger economy. And then I'm sure all of you are aware of Raj Chetty's work showing a connection between family structure, again at the ecological level, and mobility for the kids in the poorest quintile and their odds of moving up to the top quintile by the time they reach adulthood. So he finds this as an important predictor. And looking at the largest metro areas in the United States, he found that the most mobile metro region, that is the region where kids who were born poor were most likely to kind of realize the American dream, is Salt Lake City. And for reasons that I think you probably can all imagine, in terms of both probably Salt Lake City's vital kind of religious and civic life, as well as its family structure. And then more particularly in his work, he has found that community family structure is the, quote, single strongest correlate of upward mobility for the poor in the United States. And what's interesting, of course, here is that both kids from single-parent and two-parent families are more likely to succeed if they live in communities that are dominated by two-parent families. So again, sort of showing that the sort of ecological impact of the family extends both to kids from two-parent families and kids from single-parent families. And then finally, when you think about kind of this story, again, this is a kind of an ecological story that I think is playing out not just in the United States, but also in other countries. So in Europe, for instance, we know that kids from single mother families, even in countries with generous welfare regimes, are much more likely to experience poverty than kids who are in two-parent families. So if you care about poverty, income inequality, and opportunity in Europe and the Americas, the argument that I'm making today is that you should be concerned about sort of the quality and stability of marriage and family life more generally. So my brief presentation this morning strongly suggests that the retreat from marriage in the West has been one major cause, and I also would say consequence, of growing economic and social inequality, and in ways that have proved particularly vexing for the least among us. In short, marriage has emerged as one of the central social justice issues, I would say, for our time. And of course, up until now, few voices that are sort of raising concerns about social justice have kind of highlighted this fact. But I think it's quite likely that Pope Francis will emerge as one major exception to this pattern. So we see, for instance, in one recent address that he said, quote, "Evidence is mounting that the decline of the marriage culture is associated with increased poverty and a host of other social ills, disproportionately affecting women, children, and the elderly. It's always they who suffer the most in this crisis." So I'd hope that in this vein, I've been able to see the ways in which the decline of the marriage culture is fueling the increasingly separate and unequal character of our contemporary societies here in the West. And it's for that reason that I would conclude by saying that given the importance of marriage for social justice, we need, I think, to renew the economic, the policy, the cultural, and the religious foundations of strong and stable families throughout the West. Thank you.